So welcome everyone. It's great to have so many of you with us. Today we're really excited to be hearing from Abeera Khan. Abeera is a lecturer in gender and sexuality at the SOAS Center for Gender Studies, and her research looks at the interrelatedness of empire, gender, race, and sexuality. And you can find her work in numerous publications, including The Contrapuntal, Feminist Review, Feminist Formations, and Religion and Gender. Today, Abeera will be giving a talk entitled Beyond Queer Muslim Toward the Subjectless Politics. That'll be around 45 minutes. And then, of course, as always, we'll have time for a Q&A discussion afterwards. Okay, Abeera, over to you.
Thanks so much, Alex, and thanks for having me. So today I'll be presenting an abbreviated version of a chapter from a monograph in development that's based on my doctoral thesis. And the broader motivation of this project is an interrogation of the category of queer Muslim as it's deployed in the British context. So the monograph critically examines the production of the queer Muslim subject in Britain, asking how and why the queer Muslim subject gains relevance in particular political convergences. So broadly, to give you some context on what I'll be talking about, this project offers three interrelated queer feminist analysis of queer Muslim as a category. So first, it argues that the interpellation of the queer Muslim in the British imaginary relies on affirming Britain's imperial hostility towards Islam through sexual exceptionalism. So this hailing that forecloses a relational understanding of queer Muslim vulnerability. So in response, I foreground this relationality through a genealogical analysis of the queer Muslim subject's location within coloniality, whereby the queer Muslim holds contradictory positions in relation to what I call the ideological perseverance of Islam as threat and this looming specter of Muslim deviance. Second, this project interrogates how queer Muslim as a category has gained salience in the British landscape of identity politics under neoliberalism and post-multiculturalism. So rather than search for a history of the category's deployment, I instead suggest that we may find the reverberations of radical politic in the histories of relation that linger in anti-racist and queer of color movements. And then finally, this project argues for the necessity of ambivalence towards the category of queer Muslim itself. So I suggest that the exclusions that have congealed into the category can be overcome if we search for the collision between queer and Muslim in coalitions and sites that exist athwart from the proclaiming of queer Muslim as an identity. So today, the presentation develops the second argument, the central question of today being, how can queer Muslim subjectivation be understood beyond the institutionalization of queer and Muslim identity politics in post-multicultural Britain? So I'll be anchoring my arguments through two encounters. So the first half of the presentation is kind of revolved around an ethnographic encounter and the second archival. And in this process, this presentation does two main theoretical moves. So it confronts the kind of insufficiency of the available critiques of this institutionalization regarding epistemological complicity and the fatalism towards identity politics. So I'm going to kind of confront these two frames of arguments. And then second, I'm going to try and move away from the intersectional subject, so the queer Muslim as an intersectional subject, and instead propose a moving towards coalitional and materialist demands. So in February 2019, I attended the LGBTIQ plus intersectionality in Islam conference. It was held in the Birmingham Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and it was organized and hosted by queer Muslim organizations such as Hidayah and London Queer Muslims, and charities such as Stonewall, Finding a Voice, and Midland Heart. So the conference held a day of coinciding panels that you can see on the screen, which focused on the so-called intersectionalities of queer Muslims. So the panel titles and descriptions reflect the prevailing notion of queer Muslims as located at the intersection of queer and Muslim communities. So as you can see, the panel titles included choosing identities, sexuality post 9/11, not or, but and, being your authentic self, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm personally interested in what is absent and what is present in these events. So present is a desire for community stemming from the commonality of identity, an intersectional identity as they claim. There is a sense of camaraderie amongst the participants and organizers that's typical of urban queer spaces. So a general sense of affability by those familiar with the queer Muslim scene in the UK and those who were new to it, a requisite injection of gossip conspiratorially shared over coffee breaks, and an oscillation between mirth and melancholy depending on the panel topics. So there was also a sizable number of people who had come seeking community. So I met one person, a young white American revert to Islam, who had flown in from the US for the conference. So this person, like many, sought common ground and community at this event. So while the conference may be a balm for the alienation, conscious or subconscious, experienced by its participants, what primarily concerns me is its implicit absences that are routine to the evocation of the queer Muslim. So in public discourses of self-representation, queer Muslims are often interpolated as intersectional subjects that exist at the point where the identity categories and lived experiences of queer and Muslim collide. So the conference rehearses a familiar script when it comes to queer Muslims in the UK, namely the centering of queer Muslim experience and voices. But this fixation on individual narratives and interiority, even if presented as a collection of individual testimonies, temper any critical analysis of the role of social and historical processes in configuring queer Muslim identity and experience. So in particular, the use of intersectionality in this conference produces the queer Muslim as an essentialized, marginalized subject, injured mainly, if not solely, by the cultural exclusions from the Muslim community on one hand and the queer community on the other. So there's this recurring myopia in the conference that typifies the landscape of queer Muslim identity politics. There's no mention of the decade of austerity and its impact on access to social services and welfare, no reference to the UK's hostile environment to prevent and policies of surveillance and securitization that disproportionately target Muslim and racialized communities in Britain. So the one panel on the asylum system was cancelled. So 3 years prior to this conference, Dame Louise Casey undertook a review into integration opportunity in Britain's so-called most isolated and deprived communities. So this was the 2016 Casey Review, which was commissioned by the Conservative government. So the review's foreword tempers its aim to, quote, improving the integration and life chances of some of the most disadvantaged and isolated communities, end quote, with the admission that the review's spotlighting of Muslims will add to the pressure that they already feel. So while the review focuses on socioeconomic disadvantage, it demonstrates an appalling inability to connect the economic to the social or indeed the cultural. So Casey outlines how Black, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi communities experience unemployment 3 times more than white communities, that Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities are disproportionately represented in the most deprived areas of England, that rates of social mobility for Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups are significantly lower than for white groups. No connection is made between these economic exclusions and the review's finding that over half of the British public asserted, quote, a fundamental clash between Islam and the values of British society, end quote. Nor is this related to its assertion of British Muslims' so-called less progressive views regarding, quote, women's equality, sexuality, and freedom of speech. So here, the British state's narrativization of Muslims as cultural pathology shrouds how race renders them, in Jackie Wang's words, vulnerable to hyperexploitation and expropriation in the economic domain, and vulnerability to premature death in the political and social domain. So the conference's inability to locate its intersectional frame within an assessment of structural violence is analogous to the Casey Review's bifurcation of British Muslims' cultural isolation from their structural deprivation. So in both cases, Muslims' alleged cultural incompatibility is presented as at once homogeneous and in this historical, social, political, economic vacuum, rendering it innate and masking the coupled force of organized violence and organized abandonment. So the conference and its ilk untethered the figure of the queer Muslim from a landscape of real and urgent structural violence. So I want to position this untethering as symptomatic of the mediation of sexuality into the demand for sexual citizenship formulated through the liberal notion of the individual transparent self. So here, queer Muslim identity and its concomitant political claims become tethered solely to their ability to demand recognition based on cultural exclusion. So left unattended is how the cultural is formed with and through historical and economic conditions. So rather than frame this as an inevitability of what has been called epistemological complicity, it's more useful to understand this particular defanging of identity politics through an attention to how different social and historic forces have imposed contingencies on how identity can be mobilized in Britain. So the narrow scope of queer Muslim politics demonstrated at the conference may neither surprise nor frustrate the queer theory trained paranoid reader. So you might even anticipate it, a trained reflex of practicing what Eve Sedgwick has called a hermeneutics of suspicion. So I'm less interested in indulging in a reparative or paranoid reading of this landscape. And instead, I want to ask, what is revealed about the potential of queer politics when we unravel the various processes that tether any and all articulations of sexual subjectivity to sexual citizenship? So Joseph Massad's Desiring Arabs elucidates how capitalism's universal reach, an important distinction from the position that capitalism has a universalizing effect, was formative not only for the imperialist projects, but also for Arab nationalist and Islamist projects as well. So Massad argues that Arab nationalists, Islamists, and what he calls gay internationalists are complicit in adopting a European ontology and epistemology that on the one hand produces Islam as a nebulous and homogenous system of thought, and on the other hand universalizes a specifically European regime of sexuality along the hetero-homo binary. And in this process, he argues, it concedes to European notions of history along cultural and civilizational terms. So indeed, one could neatly fit the deployment of queer Muslim identity politics that we've just seen within Massad's frame. So it's firmly institutionalized in in the politics of what Massad calls the gay international. It's invested in a queer visibility that arguably essentializes Islam, and it's on the pursuit of recognition through sexuality in quotes and sexual citizenship. However, I'm unsatisfied with Massad's relegation of sexuality as epistemological complicity, a fait accompli of any and all queer politics, particularly in the non-West or in diasporic communities in the West. So this dissatisfaction is not rooted in scholarly disagreement with his analysis, but rather an ambivalence to this formulation of complicity and an acceptance of differing political projects. So Massad's argument that sexual citizenship cannot allow for an anti-imperialist stance under the ontology, what he calls ontology of queerness, is an expression of disinterest in the many ways that queer and trans theory, particularly trans and queer Marxism and trans and queer of color critique, challenge the narrow parameters of sexual citizenship and dislodge sexuality's universalization. So what I'm more interested in is how these theorists strategically confront these issues of epistemology under capitalism as they relate to the possibilities and limitations of political mobilizations, particularly mobilizations that address the very deprivation of life that I think also concerns Massad. So given that universalization is core to Massad's argument, I think it's worth turning to transnational and global South scholarship and its contentions with the limits of his argument. So while Massad does not necessarily evoke identity politics per se, he is cynical of how parochial epistemologies and their concomitant identity categories are universalized through the circulation of imperial capital. So here, in terms of rejoinders, I find Evren Savci's reflections on the asymmetries of scholarly attention to the effects of imperial capital when it comes to queer politics, particularly in the non-West, helpful in this regard. So I'll give you all a couple of seconds to just read the quote because it's quite long. So Savci's last question in particular points to the limits of Massad's critique when she says, are there any political positions that are not produced by capitalist modernity and therefore authentic to the non-West? So while Massad is adamant that his critique of sexuality is not meant to fall into the authenticity trap, and indeed he critiques the essentializing effects of scholarship that attempts to locate authentic sexual taxonomies, it's worth reflecting on how sexuality is not the only form circulated as onto-epistemological through capitalism's universalizing impulse. So I'm interested in Savci's last provocation regarding the impossibility of political positions anterior to capitalist modernity. Massad's wholesale dismissal of queer politics neglects the issue of what Christopher Chitty calls the problem of sexual hegemony, whether and how sexuality outside marriage and property relations congealed into opposition, defiance, or open antagonism towards socially dominant group and institutions. So while Massad's critique is useful for critically analyzing how sexuality is translated differentially through sexual citizenship, he forecloses the possibility of how these hegemonies can be articulated in defiance of institutions such as the family, property, the gender binary, and the couple form. All apparatuses that are also subject to the same universalization and service of imperial capital that he attributes to the homo-hetero binary. So instead, attending the historical production and material conditioning of sexual and gender subjectivities across racialization and the scalar geographies of global North and global South can preempt facile dismissals of queer politics as epistemological complicity. So turning away for a moment from the homo-heterobinary to, for example, the circulation of the category of transgender can elucidate how to seriously contend with this argument. So theorists of trans studies and non-Western contexts productively work through how the circulation of transgender as a category mediates both through circuits of epistemology and capital. So for instance, Anuradha Datta and Rainer Roy's 2014 article, Decolonizing Transgender in India, analyzes how the institutionalization of the category of transgender in India as the category that captures gender non-variance, particularly by the nonprofit sector, delegitimizes Dalit and working class epistemologies. However, the authors point out that this dominance of transgender as a category cannot be simply captured through the narrow binary frames such as global, local, or authentic and imported. Instead, the limitations of official definitions, such as the emergence and institutionalization of third gender by the Indian state, are navigated based on material need and political strategy rather than a sincere identification. As such, rather than offering a wholesale rejection of transgender or faulting gender variant communities who engage with the category, they locate its limitations within the landscape of state domination and transnational circuits of capital. So this analysis resonates with Laetitia Subse's work on the limitations posed by liberal conceptions of sexual subjectivity, specifically how sexual citizenship individuates and renders static the sexual so that they may only cohere through the language of the transparent self. So I find Datta and Roy's intervention useful in thinking through this bind. They caution against attempts to make trans and gender variant lives more legible to institutions, but they also refrain from proposing non-engagement with institutions that need to be navigated by gender variant people out of necessity. Instead, any proposition towards a decolonial approach to gender and sexual variance in India cannot be achieved without dismantling the global, national, regional, and local political economy and the class, caste, and racial hierarchies that compel gender variant communities to navigate subsistence through the narrow and discriminatory confines of the state, the development sector, and indeed citizenship itself. So reprimands of identity politics articulated through these accusations of epistemological complicity disregard how disparately located trans and queer politics can enact a reflexivity that engages with the contingencies and limitations of the categories that circulate from the intertwined transnational circuits of capital and epistemology. So how does this relate to queer Muslims in Britain? So I'm not interested in facile proposals of queer Muslim, either as a category or as an identity politic, as innately radical. So as we see in the intersectionality conference, nor am I interested in relegating it to always failing to enact radical politics because of the circumstances of its conception, i.e. epistemological complicity, or the circumstances of its execution, i.e. identity politics. Rather, I think it's more useful to attend to how the radical capacity of identity politics have been deliberately eroded over time, in part through the neoliberal turn and austerity. So in his article, The Neoliberal Revolution, Stuart Hall draws links between three UK prime ministers, Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, and David Cameron. So writing in 2011, for Hall, the crisis of the time, which is the defeat of Blair's New Labour, the ascendancy of the Conservative Liberal Democratic Coalition, and the introduction of the austerity program, was part and parcel of the long march of the neoliberal revolution from the 1970s onwards. Hall's charting of the many conjunctures of British neoliberalism is particularly helpful in understanding both the decimation of grassroots, anti-racist, feminist, and queer organizing, and the instantiation of the hegemony of the rights-bearing sexual subject. So the three leaders can't be understood as practicing a uniform neoliberalism, but for Hall, they do bear enough continuities that can be used as approximation of their policies. So to understand neoliberalism's impact on anti-racist, feminist, and queer organizing is to pay attention to its reconfiguration of the national landscape at the level of ideology, economics, and social policy. Thatcher's infamous claim that there is no such thing as a society encapsulates all three political leaders and their ethos. So while obviously variegated, the UK has, over the course of several decades, been subjected to an amalgamation of disastrous privatization and marketizing policies. Sorry, just saw the chat. Trigger warning to come in the future. While obviously variegated, the UK has, over the course of several decades, been subjected to an amalgamation of disastrous privatization marketizing policies that have decimated the welfare system, increasingly relied on the scapegoating of racial and sexual others, accelerated privatization of property and marketization of key services, and eroded the political power of trade unions. So what impact did this march of neoliberalism have on the radical social movements? So particularly those centering identity politics. So Tracy Fisher argues that this, quote, continuous shift to the right, end quote, from Thatcher onwards resulted in what she calls a flattening of the left. Speaking to the impact of Thatcherite politics, specifically on Black feminist organizing, Fisher argues that the erosion of the welfare state, in part, contributed to the transformation of radical organizations into service providers addressing the void of support left behind by decades of neoliberal policymaking. In the context of British multiculturalism, this has meant the celebration of diversity, even as the material realities of difference are relegated to the responsibility of the individual and the family unit. So this contemporary moment lays bare the conditional nature of these promises of inclusion. I'm happy to chat about that more in the Q&A. So this erosion and institutionalization constrained the emergence and mobilization of subsequent and emergent forms of identity politics. I understand the conference's narrow approach to identity politics as symptomatic of both its charity status and the neoliberal landscape, which has limited the scope of institutional mobilizations of identity politics. The transition from grassroots collective mobilization to the charity model hinged on attending to specific groups by working within the system cannot be separated from decades of neoliberal policy. So for instance, charities in the UK are prohibited from existing for a political purpose and must maintain political neutrality as organizations receiving public funds, limiting both their political imagination and will. Being beholden to government and donor funding also means they're less likely to take political risks and challenges, and their political aspirations revolve around legislative rights and political recognition. So queer Muslim charities then reify what I call an identitarian attachment to legitimize the language of rights and inclusion, rather than critique the social relations that necessitate the naming of the identity in the first place. So the charity sector is unsurprisingly not conducive to material demands for redistribution. But what is alarming, however, is its role in institutionalizing and defanging identity politics. So the current state of institutionalized queer Muslim organizing can be understood in part as symptomatic of the legacy of Thatcherite politics. So Yasmin Gunaratnam argues that post-structuralist critiques of essentialism and social constructionist views on race and ethnicity are necessary, but need to be allied with the recognition of the contingency of lived experience and its varied negotiations. But this is the dilemma of identity politics. While foregrounding lived experience can counter the essentialism of identity categories, such that they are cordoned off from social, material, and emotional relations, experience is now the very language of these essentialisms. So queer Muslim mobilizations, such as the conference, do not affirm the limitations of identity politics itself, but rather demonstrate, in my opinion, how activist formations informed by a critical approach to capitalism's entrenchment of difference have been eroded over time. So here I find the proposal of subjectless critique useful to think through the bifurcation of identitarian attachments from more material demands for justice. So first introduced by David L. Eng, Jack Halberstam, and Jose Esteban Munoz in their introduction to What's Queer About Queer Studies Now. Subjectless critique is proposed as an alternative to the fixation on the sexual subject or sexuality. So for the authors, the queer in queer studies has no fixed political referent. It instead disallows any positing of a proper subject of or object for the field. So subjectless critique is, for the authors, not automatic to queer studies, but instead a necessary orientation for it to attend to its own exclusions. So this subsequent attention to queer studies exclusions has at times, I think, resulted in the assumption of an automatic alterity of racialized queer subjects. This, I think, is the result of attempts to reorient the normative referent of queer studies from the implicit white queer to the explicit racialized queer. So this is particularly relevant to queer studies of scholarship and queer Muslims, whereby queer Muslims are emphasized as either intersectional or hybrid subjects. I find these frames limiting, however, because the ideological and material conditions of possibility of the subject are still opaque. What I mean by this is that it tells us little about how the subject of the gay or queer or LGBTQ plus Muslim coheres in the first place. So subjectless critique is revisited 15 years later in David L. Eng and Jasbir Puar's Left of Queer, where they revisit debates concerning the alleged incommensurability between queer studies and Marxism. So in particular, their critique of the dichotomization of the Western queer and the post-colonial queer is helpful in challenging the notion of an inherent alterity. So they argue the Western queer and the post-colonial queer, including the transnational activist that sutures them together, are neither developmental nor oppositional categories. Rather, they must be approached as dialectic counterparts created through the same social relations of production that expose the capitalist, i.e. economic, nationalist, i.e. political, and liberal individualist, i.e. cultural assumptions foreclosing other histories of materiality and other social relations and relationalities. As such, while the queer Muslim in Britain may not neatly fit into either the paradigm of either the Western or post-colonial queer, I'm interested in how its contemporary subjectivation may emerge within the same social relations of production. So how can we attend to the capitalist, nationalist, and liberal individualist assumptions that are otherwise elided by the dominant intersectional scholarship on queer Muslims? So it's here that I turn to the archive as an alternative site of critical analysis of queer Muslim subjectivation. Rather than a project of excavating a heretofore repressed queer Muslim subject, I want to instead enact an analysis that may help us understand the formation of the subject through capitalism, racialization, and deviant gendering and sexuality. So in the second half of this chapter, I turn to archival materials to think through the proposition of subjectless critique. So what I'm trying to do here is, rather than searching for an intersectional queer subject in the archive, I kind of try to consider what past mobilizations of identity politics can offer for a critical analysis of queer Muslims in the present. So for example, you have on the screen this postcard from 2005 promoting an Iman conference. So Iman is one of the oldest existing queer Muslim charities in the UK. And you can see on the screen here that the topics that are covered in this conference in 2005 are actually very similar to the conference that was analyzed in the first section, right? So it's the same of like what Islam says about homosexuality, Islamophobia in the queer community, etc. It's very much the same recurring frame of the exclusion from the white queer community and the exclusion from the Muslim community. And I think this also speaks to how these issues are framed as timeless, even though a lot has happened between 2005, between these kind of two conferences that I show you, right? So there's this real kind of like neglect of the kind of political, social, and circumstances and structures that kind of contour these events. So instead of kind of looking or relying on this appearance of the queer Muslim in the archive, I instead turned to kind of to instances of anti-racist and queer solidarities. Oh, sorry. So the one-sided flyer pictured on the screen promotes a public meeting in London organized by two activist groups, the London Gay Activists Alliance and the Bradford Asian Youth Group. So the Bishopsgate Archive in London dates the flyer to 1978 and indexes it under political campaigning ephemera within a specific subsection of papers regarding various labor and LGBT campaigns. So the flyer begins with two demands, simple in their lucidity: defend Frank Kelly and Shaukat Ali, and end police harassment of Blacks and gays. It goes on to explain how Frank Kelly, the gay subject in question, and Shaukat Ali, the Black subject in question, require a defense against police harassment. Kelly faces the prospect of life imprisonment for engaging in buggery, i.e. sodomy, with a person aged under 21, which presumably is Ali, under the Sexual Offences Act of 1967. Ali, according to the flyer, has been under the threat of deportation through the Immigration Acts. The police have leveraged this vulnerability to coerce a false confession from Ali, while Kelly was subjected to 28 hours of questioning that similarly resulted in a coerced confession. The flyer goes on to explain that the context of police harassment of gay men and immigrants in Bradford, where Kelly and Ali are located, through the discriminatory laws in question. Frank Kelly and his homosexual plight appear more prominently over Shaukat Ali in the flyer, and we're told that Kelly is a committed anti-fascist and gay activist. But we know little of Ali besides the inference that he is an immigrant below the age of 21. So we don't know if Ali has an occupation, to where he would be deported, or the duration of his time in the UK. The flyer contextualizes the widespread patterns of intimidation, the weaponized consenting sexual acts to entrap and intimidate gay men, but less details are provided for the police harassment and legislation faced by immigrants. So here, I think it's worth noting the use of Black to refer to the racial position of someone otherwise advocated for the Asian youth movement is most likely through the paradigm of political Blackness. So in the 1970s and 80s, political Blackness was used as an umbrella term by some Asian, African, and Caribbean migrants in Britain, and this was very much located within kind of like trade union activism. I'm happy to also field more questions about this if needed in the Q&A. So anyway, I'm taken by the imperative statement at the heart of this material project. So end police harassment of Blacks and gays. So the subject, end police harassment, is oriented through the objects, Blacks and gays. The formulation of these objects as separated through the conjunction and may seemingly betray the intersectional frame of a simultaneously Black and gay subject. A paranoid reading of the flyer would enact hermeneutics of suspicion by fixating on its intersectional failure, its inability to read Shaukat Ali as a queer of color subject. Such a paranoid reading of this ephemera would enact several fallible logics. Reading the imperative as a failure of recognition would prioritize queer identification, enacting a desire for categorization into sexual types and transparency as a sexual subject. This imposition of homosexual identity form onto a subject that hasn't been interpolated as such would impose a form of queer normativity, chromonormativity. So chromonormativity would impose on Shaukat Ali the expectation of following the sequential order that is the normative expectation of queer life in contemporary times. Queer desire and or acts necessitate the progress of coming out, which then congeals into queer identification. So a paranoid reading of Ali's failure to be interpolated as a queer subject would allow the contemporary queer reader the self-congratulatory feeling of being more evolved than one's context. So rather than repudiate this material object for an intersectional failure, I want to instead offer a reparative reading of its political orientation. So how does the imperative's subject, a cogent political demand, impart solidarity between its objects? A reparative stance allows for a queer reading of the relational anti-racist, anti-homophobic demand recorded by the ephemera as illustrative of solidaristic resistance. In the absence of an intersectional subject, it is the subject of the statement that inculcates solidarity between queer and racialized vulnerability. The objects of the imperative, blacks and gays, are positioned in relation through the dictate and police harassment. So here, the evasion of a black and gay subject can be read less as a deliberate evasion of an intersectional subject, or so-called intersectional subject, but instead as a coalition that attends to the differentiated but still related vulnerabilities of queer and racialized communities to border and carceral violence. So while Kelly, as a British citizen, is threatened with life imprisonment for buggery with a person under the age of 21, it's Ali's status as a racialized migrant with presumably precarious migrant status that allows the state to weaponize his participation in a consenting sexual act by coercing a confession through the threat of deportation. So Kelly's prosecution under the Sexual Offences Act is the carceral response to a subject that is still recognized as part of the nation, albeit a subject that threatens the nation through their anti-fascist politics and homosexuality. This is not to compare imprisonment and deportation through relativism, but this is to say that Kelly's intelligibility to the state and the law occurs differently than Ali's. Ali becomes legible not through his participation in the sexual act that contravenes the law, but first and foremost through his migrant status. Here, the state isn't invested in a punitive response to Ali's sexual act. This is a response reserved for those subjects that are still seen as citizens, albeit deviant ones. Instead, in the production and management of difference, Ali's racialization takes precedence. The carceral response to Ali is to physically enforce his outsider status with a literal threat of extraction from the national body. As such, the flyer's imperative to end police harassment holds within it a recognition of the related but still differentiated vulnerabilities of racialized and gay communities under the British state. This practice of solidarity is in sharp contrast to the contemporary mainstream deployments of queer Muslim identity politics, which fall short of addressing structural material vulnerabilities. So this reading the flyer is not meant to be a castigation of identity politics, nor is it intended to perform a nostalgia that aggrandizes past queer and anti-racist movements as more radical. Anti-racist, anti-fascist, and queer politics persist despite the transformation of the hierarchies that continue to stratify British society. So instead, this archival residuum can expand what counts as the history and foreshadowing of politics that are produced through the collision between queer and Muslim. This can be done precisely by relinquishing our identitarian attachments to categories that rely on a reading of the past through the desire for transparent, self-possessing subjects. Further, it can allow us to pay attention to expansive political possibilities in our contemporary imaginations of the future, imaginations that can strive to untether themselves from the feigned totality of liberal forms of recognition as the bases and aims of queer of color politics. So here it's also worth paying attention to the flyer's second imperative statement. These disgusting laws should be abolished. So the demand for the abolition of the very laws that structure the vulnerability of the objects of the flyer, Kelly and Ali, is to me the logical conclusion of a solidarity hinged on attending to social relations. Reading this past demand through a future vision, we can see here a foreshadowing of abolition feminism. This is not a demand hinged on clarifying the innocence of those persecuted under these laws to unwittingly create a division between the deserving and undeserving. Nor is it a reformist demand that requests discernment from the state and its homophobia and racism. Instead, it performs a very coalition building that calls for direct resistance to the vulnerabilities produced at the intersection of immigration and criminalization. This demand sits in stark contrast to the appeals for inclusion and the dismissal of abolitionist politics by queer Muslim activists that I've discussed in some of my other published work. And yet, this is where I wish to enact the methodology of hope that's been espoused by Jose Esteban Munoz by drawing on ephemeral and conjectural analysis that gestures towards a queerness hinged on potentiality and the educated hope of the collective. So Munoz draws on the work of Bloch to propose hope as a methodology that reaches towards concrete rather than abstract utopias. And in contrast to the lack of historical consciousness symptomatic of abstract utopias, concrete utopias, according to Munoz, propel a queer political imagination informed by relation and struggles, situated with the hopes of strategizing towards the radical transformation of our material circumstances of dispossession. So my reparative reading of this ephemera is located within a practice of this methodology, one that treats queerness and community with a healthy skepticism. But this approach doesn't espouse the negativity of anti-relational politics. Instead, it chooses to read against the grain as a form of vigilance, with a duty to tend to forms of community mobilizations that are rendered illegible and evanescent by the very social forces invested in profiting off of the degradation of our political imaginations. So it's within this queer practice that I want to quickly turn to the figure of Shaukat Ali. So scholars of sexuality such as Anjali Arundekar, Joseph Massad, Afsane Najmabadi, and Siobhan Somerville warn against the anachronistic imposition of sexual classifications and identities onto temporal and spatial contexts that didn't otherwise prescribe to these historically contingent formations of sexuality. So while disparate in their disciplinary approaches, these scholars argue for a distinction between sexual acts and sexual types, whereby the former often doesn't neatly align with the latter. So while Ali is recognized and engaging in a same-sex act, he isn't interpolated by the ideological positions of the law or the activist groups involved in the flyer as a homosexual, nor is there any evidence of his own identification with homosexuality. And this is how I wish to read Shaukat Ali's appearance in the archive, not through imposing the logics of sexual types and retroactively reading him as a homosexual or queer subject, or indeed a queer Muslim subject. This would fall into the trap of an anachronistic identitarian attachment. Instead, I want to approach his brief appearance in the archive as demonstrating the intertwined machinations of sexuality and race. Rather than attempting to configure Ali through our present taxonomy by reading him as a queer Muslim, I think it's worth attending to the insights that can be gained from his presence. How can it expand our understanding of queer Muslim identity politics beyond the limitations of identitarian attachments? How do we salvage Shaukat Ali as more than a passing mention in someone else's queer history without assembling him as a figure to ally our own political attachments and desires? So it's with these questions in mind that I want to reflect on Ali through what Avery Gordon calls complex personhood. So she says, complex personhood means that even those called other are never that. Complex personhood means that the stories people tell about themselves, about their troubles, about their social worlds, and about their society's problems are entangled and weave between what is immediately available as a story and what their imaginations are reaching toward. So how can we attribute Ali with a complex personhood in order to weave a story that addresses him not through contemporary frames of sexual citizenship, but through the political circumstances that reveal him to us? So how does this record of Ali's material vulnerability, the threat of deportation, the state's weaponization of his participation in same-sex desire, acts and erotics tell us about society's problems of the social worlds then and now?
We'll be watching.
So further, how can we understand the depiction of Ali's vulnerability, his status as other, as reaching towards an understanding of the vulnerabilities produced through the subjectivizing collision between queer and Muslim? So to read Shaukat Ali queerly is thus not to read him as a queer subject, but to analyze how Ali becomes a subject through the discontinuities of what Jasbir Puar describes as queerly racialized populations. So this presumptive sexual deviance of certain racially gendered and or class privileged homosexuals, gays, or queers is normativized only to the extent that the management of this deviance is integral to the interplay of perversion and normativity necessary to sustain in full gear the management of life. So certain forms of deviance are institutionalized with conditions in order to facilitate the biopolitical management of other deviations from the norm. So Ali's deviance, or even Kelly's for that matter, occurs decades away from multiculturalism, its diversity projects, and its language of recognition. Indeed, it occurs decades away from the failures of multiculturalism and the declaration of its death. So neither state homophobia nor racism are clouded through the language of liberalism. They're simply espoused here as the official line. So it would be, I think, incorrect to treat these different state orientations towards race and sexuality as disparate historical moments. Ali's deviance is still mediated through the configuration of queerly racialized populations. Indeed, it prefigures its contemporary manifestations. The resonance of Ali's complex personhood, I want to posit, is not that he would in the present be accepted by the state through the contemporary formation of sexual citizenship. It's instead to understand how the story of his materialization as access to the social body would persist in the present day. So this forceful positioning of Ali outside the British social body resonates with the still present antagonism towards racialized subjects, migrants, and the violence that they're subjected to through the British border regime. So the categories have transformed over time from Black to Asian to Muslim, and so too have the laws and policies within which these categories become salient. So from the Immigration Act of 1971 to the contemporary hostile environment, the recently scrapped Rwanda bill. But it remains true that the buttressing of British citizenship, its figurative and literal borders, occurs through the violent conjoined instrumentalization of race and sexuality. So Ali, regardless of the temporal regimes that instantiate him, is dependent on an intersubjective encounter that would reproduce notions of deviance to enforce what Lisa Lowe calls the colonial divisions of humanity. Divisions that remain key to the literal and figurative borders of Britain. So this process is always hinged on the boundary making of both the individual and its relation to the social body. Accounting for this relation requires attending to a variety of historical processes, such as how and why public cultures of homosexuality are perceived as threatening across different periods, and challenging the notion that queerphobia is a timeless ideology that can be relegated to the realm of the cultural and religious. So how does Ali's body come to matter, and how does it materialize? To address the role of difference in answering these questions is to critically analyze the intersubjective encounters that make certain bodies matter and materialize in certain relational ways. So Ali and his vulnerability as a person that can be threatened with deportation in response to a sexual act is dependent on his difference as a migrant. Ali materializes as difference embodied because his body takes a certain shape in relation to other bodies. Frank Kelly, who is subjected to a different form of vulnerability, even as his vulnerability is constituted through a shared sexual act. The British police officers who detain, harass, intimidate, and coerce a confession of Ali because he is at risk of deportation. The gay and Asian activists who mobilize against his domination in solidarity and in relation. The British body politic, which inheres his arrest, his looming deportation, and his materialization as an other to be disciplined, managed, and ultimately expelled from the social body of the nation. So to enact a queer reading in the service of configuring a complex personhood for Ali is to refuse his individuation as a singular antagonist, where this antagonism is located as either racialized or sexualized or both. Instead, what I'm proposing is an understanding of Ali's vulnerability that is queerly racialized, in that it's rooted in the apprehension of how sexuality, race, and migration orient him through an intersubjective encounter. So this encounter not only affects Ali as a body that materializes through his difference, but also affects the boundary of state, citizenship, and even homosexuality. So Ruth Wilson Gilmore, for instance, argues that the social processes of domination rely on the figure of the enemy to uphold what she calls civil and quasi-social death. So she says, through forcefully twinned processes of articulation and abstraction, lived narratives of difference become singularly dramatized as modalities of antagonism, whose form of embodied appearance is the overdetermined, racialized, gendered, nationalized criminal enemy. So a more materialist approach considers not what or who is queer, but the material conditions that make queer subjects possible. To allow Ali's lived narrative of difference to become singularly dramatized, the story of an individual who could be read as a queer Muslim would be to ignore the social and historical processes that render him and others like and unlike him deviant in relational manners. So I'll stop there. because the chapter goes on and on. And yeah, I can stop sharing the screen as well.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much, Abeera. That was the theoretical reflections, the empirical detail. It was all very, very rich. My head is kind of like very full at the moment. I'm glad we have some time. So we have like 35 minutes for a discussion or a dialogue. I'm going to let people collect their thoughts, but if you have any questions for Abeera, you can either unmute yourself, raise your hand and unmute yourself and speak, or if you prefer, you can also put your question in the chat and then I will read it out loud and then Abeera will be able to take it. Okay, any questions or comments for Abeera? Okay, I might start while people formulate their questions. I'm thinking, so I guess I have a question about subjectification under neoliberalism and then sort of where we are today. So if the presentation was about sort of a critique of neoliberal identity politics, or actually more accurately, a critique of how neoliberalism has like foreclosed the potential or potency of identity politics. To what extent are we still there? Because some people talk about a decline in certain liberal forms of identity politics as the state becomes more authoritarian and so on. Do you think that rupture is overstated? And also, I guess like the material conditions over the past couple of years, have they changed such that the forms of subjectification have also changed? Basically, like how new is the conjuncture that we're currently in?
Yeah, I think this is something I've been thinking about a lot as I try and work on the monograph, because I feel like the monograph kind of ends at like the David Cameron era of politics and hasn't really reckoned with like the post-Brexit landscape, not to exceptionalize Brexit, but you know, it was, I guess, like a rupture for the UK. And I think it hasn't I think I'm still thinking through like our current conjuncture, which I don't think can be captured under the frame of neoliberalism. Like I think it very much doesn't capture. I don't think that neoliberalism is sufficient in capturing the kind of turn or the kind of like fascist turn that we're seeing now. But I do think it's left the door open for it, you know? So that's how I make sense of it. And I think here, like I've been thinking a lot, like this is not related to queer Muslims necessarily, but I've been thinking a lot about like I think the contemporary analyses of moral panics around trans people and around trans children can really help us understand like how subjectivation works and also like how we're not there still, you know? Like how you said, to what extent are we still there? So like here I'm thinking of like the Max Fox, Kay Gabriel kind of like debate, or like not debate necessarily, but like how they've both been differently formulating the panic around trans children and like how they bring in their own analyses, materialist analyses on the two, yeah, their own materialist analyses. And I'm not going to try and like summarize their arguments, but I do think those are the kind of analyses to me point to how we're not in that moment anymore, you know? So like there's not so much a commodification of the celebration of difference, right? And I don't think there ever was like a totalizing celebration of difference, but instead there's this the kind of that kind of liberalism left the door open for more, I would say, like far right co-options of difference, of the kind of hierarchies of difference and their kind of positive valences that are attributed to it, in the kind of current crises, basically. So yeah, that's my kind of assertion.
Brilliant. Yeah. Amazing. Thanks. Okay. Any questions? Yes, Magdalena. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I really loved how you were able to work together the 70s and the present. And I wanted to ask you if you would speak a little bit more to what sources are available to you in the Bishopsgate archives. Is it just this one piece of paper, or is there more for you to look at and analyze? Thank you.
So I did this archival research right before the pandemic hit. And so I remember, so like in the chapter, I talk about how like I've put in different keywords to think, like to basically look for like what comes up when you look, like put in Muslim, etc. And a lot of it is like there's a lot of stuff around like the fatwa, like the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, for example, and the satanic verses. There's a lot of stuff around that, but there wasn't that much that showed up in terms of like the LGBT Muslim or queer Muslim besides this. But since then, I've done some workshops, where I did a workshop for Bishopsgate. I taught like a short workshop for them on basically what is this talk of like how do we think about materialist identity politics through the archive. And so in doing that, in like kind of doing the research and collecting like ephemera around that topic, a lot more has been donated in like the span of 4 years, but it's a lot of like there was like posters of like a queer Muslim person from Stonewall who's I think like who works in like finance and is basically like, you know, it's like a poster for like Stonewall. So it is in a way it's like very much of the same kind of type of like material that I'm criticizing, or not criticizing the material, but the same kind of like politics that I'm criticizing. So they'll have like they've like someone's donated like materials from other like queer Muslim organizations, or like there was some like stuff from queer Muslim lesbians, for example, that similarly does this work of again like being stuck with the between this like exclusion from queer and Muslim communities. And so in the workshop, for example, I was able to kind of contrast those materials with like Herring Gay Black Action Group and like Gay Liberation Front and like a bunch of other kind of organizations that kind of did the more rigorous political work on like housing and like anti-imperial solidarity and, you know, like more material demands. So yeah, the Bishopsgate archive is in itself like excellent. The people there are so lovely. But yeah, that's the kind of materials that are on offer.
Any other questions? I was actually just randomly, oh, okay, we have a question from, 1 second. Okay, Lola Lefemi asks, how do you think organizers can provide a counter narrative to liberal interpolations of the queer Muslim in a way that builds a critical mass? What does that counter narrative look like? Counter protest. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think like this kind of work is already happening. I get this like a version of this question a lot. I think in a way that's what I'm trying to hint at with my work, which is that I think rather than trying to do some kind of like reclaiming work of the category of the queer Muslim to say, to like make it more, I don't know, radical or more politically rigorous, I think instead it's more useful to think about like how this kind of work is already happening, but it may not be happening under the category of queer Muslim, but we need to pay attention to that. So I mean, like for example, like there are a lot of like direct organizing groups in London where people who I know who happen to be queer Muslim are organizing, but they're not necessarily organizing under the banner of queer Muslimness. They're actually organizing like against austerity cuts or, you know, for like Palestinian liberation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one side of it. I also think that this article that I've published in the Feminist Review on these protests that were happening in a Muslim community, in a working class Muslim community in Birmingham against these like sexual education programs for young kids and predominantly Muslim communities. There was an article that was published, like an open letter that was published, challenging the framing of these protests that like basically like evolved into like a moral panic about the backwardness of Muslim communities. And this open letter, like I know the organizers of the open letter, I won't name them because I don't know who they're I don't know if they would want to be named publicly, but in conversation with the people who organize these open letters, a lot of them were like individuals and academics who were basically challenging the like scapegoating of Muslim communities for like counterterrorism programs, etc. And there were a lot of queer Muslim organizations that didn't want to sign on, you know, or there were a lot of like popular queer Muslim activists that very much refused this challenging of like basically like this like state violence, and like saw it as necessary. So I also think that there is something to be said about how like queer Muslim is not the category that necessarily needs to be injected or reclaimed with radical politics, and instead maybe it's worth considering. What I'm trying to do with this project is also consider why is it that queer Muslim can sometimes collect these like political orientations that are otherwise problematic, to put it lightly. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, although.
Can I ask a follow-up question? I'm wondering, since October 7th, there, in the way that people talk about queer, the figure of the queer Palestinian or the queer Arab, have you like observed this as being somehow analogous to the way that we were talking in sort of the early war on terror? Yeah, that's quite broad, but
yeah. So do you want to tell me how you think how they're being talked about, so I know exactly?
Well, yes, I'm just thinking of how like people in response to let's say sort of like homo nationalist discourses that have been sort of that have sort of reemerged in the wake of October 7th. One response has been, well, there are also gay and lesbian Palestinians, which is kind of like an intersectionality frame.
Yeah,
it's like, yeah, and it's sometimes it's like, well, even if there weren't queer and lesbian Palestinians, we would still be against the genocidal war. But also I'm wondering what your analysis about what sort of subjectless critique and thinking more about the material conditions under which queer life emerges or even can emerge in the first place, what that might look like in the ways that we talk about Palestine from sort of the queer pro-Palestinian left.
Yeah, I think the way that I think about that, so like the way that I understand homo nationalism in the way that Poir articulated it in the kind of immediate aftermath of 9/11/war on terror, is that like capitalism and the state's relationship to gender and sexuality transforms, right? And it's kind of like how, and the kind of vectors of citizenship, etc. And so I find it always useful to come back to the categories of gender and sexuality. So in the contemporary moment, for example, in the genocide in Palestine, I think the abjection is so totalizing that citizenship, gender, sexuality doesn't matter. Like on a material level, those categories just don't matter. So what I mean by that is that the argument, there are also queer and Palestinian lives, like there are also queer Palestinians in Gaza or whatever, and that's how we should care about it, I think neglects the fact that when Israel, like in the last 9 months, when Israel has been bombing Gaza, there's no distinction of gender or sexuality or even race or class, right? Like these categories have completely fallen apart in a genocide in terms of their material experience. So like on the level of like signification, right? Like there might be differences in the experience of the genocide, obviously. So there are gendered experiences of the genocide, et cetera, and classed experiences of the genocide. But on the level of like, on the level of subordination, on the level of domination, it's totalizing. Gender and sexuality have fallen apart, right? So I think that's how I make sense of like the difference. That is that like you need to be able to be like life is not livable anymore. And so those categories fall apart as well.
Shiva asks, what led you to the research in the first place?
Basically frustration with what was being written about on queer Muslims like 5-7 years ago. So I yeah, when I was doing my own kind of research, I was just like really there's a lot of like redundant scholarship on queer Muslims that either, so there's like two big kind of schools of literature. So one that either focuses on the hermeneutics of the Quran in relation to sexuality and gender. So basically, you know, like queer readings of the Quran or like readings of Islam and its practices and theology that would, you know, presumably like affirm gender and sexual non-normativity. And on the other hand, you have this kind of like big school of literature that basically argues and again that like queer Muslims are intersectional. Like there is like it's basically like different variations of this argument. But there is kind of a lack of analysis of, you know, why have people started identifying as queer Muslims? So what are the historical social processes that have made that category relevant in the first place? Or like what are the kind of politics that are collected under that category? Or how is the queer Muslim related to the figure of the homophobic Muslim or the misogynist Muslim? Or even like how is the queer Muslim related to the material histories and like social political histories of the Muslim woman as the kind of victim position of like Muslim communities in the West or in like Muslim states, etc. So like those are the kind of questions that I was interested in, but wasn't seeing a response or an exploration of. So I decided to do it myself.
Any other questions? Okay, here's one from Sabrina. I'm reading this out loud for the recording, by the way. Okay, so Sabrina asks, "Hi, Abeera. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the work of unions in the examples you brought forward. I'm also thinking of the prevalence of unions in other queer writing and literature that focus on more than just queerness, but also race and class. Would this be a type of way to build critical mass or enact a subjectless politics?"
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Sabrina. I think definitely is like one of the ways in which critical mass can be developed, even though the kind of power of unions has been really debilitated in this country by like anti-union laws. I do think that is one of the ways that like a subjectless politics can be mobilized, you know, even if it is centered towards like the workforce or the labor force. And actually I think like maybe that is like a site of neglect of queer politics, is like queer people within the category of labor, like, and how can they be organized within that? Because I think there has been this kind of disproportionate focus of like the ascendant queers who gain kind of like middle class status, maybe not as much attention paid to like queer people within a kind of like more working class or like trade union politics like formation. And also, I think just to also point out that the Asian youth movement, which was mentioned in the flyer that I analyzed. So that was like an anti-racist movement that grew out, I believe, in the 70s and 80s in the UK. And that very much grew out of trade union politics of that the history of the Asian youth movement is a history of Asian workers organizing through trade unions because of the racism and exploitation that they were facing in primarily factory work. And yeah, but basically building a kind of anti-racist kind of coalition across the country. So yeah, I do think that there is, in a way, like a subjectless politics, but also the potential of an identity politics to be done in union work.
Cool. Any other questions? Yes, Max.
Hi. Sorry, this question is a little unformed. I've been trying to figure out how to put it into words and not doing a great job. But my work is mostly on sort of sexual cultures and citizenship in the US, where it's very much framed by these conversations about religion, secularism, the First Amendment, the idea that there's no established religion in the United States, how that sort of coexists with this Christian dominance. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how that landscape shows up in the UK. How does secularism or an idea of secularism shape these conversations particularly about sexuality and religious minorities in the UK? Thank you.
Thanks, Max. That's a great question. I'm just thinking about where do I start, because secularism is so entrenched in the UK as specifically a very Islamophobic kind of formation that it's hard to articulate where you can start with this question. So I'm not that familiar with the American context, but like a lot of the work that that my monograph tries to do is also question like the fact that like the imperial hostility that I label like Britain's imperial hostility towards Islam also relies on this kind of secular hostility. So whereby like the British states like normative Protestant values, right, like cloaked Protestant values, which are labeled secular, are often, if not always, articulated against the kind of excess religiosity of Muslim communities in the UK. So this comes out a lot within the like queer political landscape. So there are a lot of queer Muslim, for example, activists, like kind of like the popular activists, will advocate for British secularism in their kind of like queer Muslim politics, even as they are kind of like holding space for kind of like queer religious spaces. There's also really vivid history, I think, post Salman Rushdie fatwa, of this kind of formation of secularism that's really allied to like new atheist racism that positions itself against Muslim communities in the UK. So like the Assad, for example, has written about like the Salman Rushdie fatwa and does this really interesting analysis about how like the fatwa is not so much the fatwa isn't so much about like freedom of speech as much as it's a disruption of like British like bourgeois sensibilities about like how one is supposed to register their disagreement with like the state, and is also like he basically argues that the fatwa, like the rupture of the fatwa in British society was also this kind of anger by like British society at the fact that like Muslims were making political demands on the state in the way that they are like that like the British state itself claims that they are able to do. So like in the kind of like British landscape, you have lots of different organizations like British Muslims for Secular Democracy, et cetera, that like in the process of arguing for like a more secular Muslim community, also affirm a lot of like end up supporting a lot of securitization and surveillance strategies that the British state uses against Muslim communities as well. So those are the kind of like ways that secularism emerges on like a contemporary level. And then there's also, I think, like I also do a bit of argument on how like secularism is also kind of like there's a kind of psychic imperial antagonism in the UK when it comes to this kind of like binary of secularism versus Islam that I think like is too big to capture here. But I hope that answers your question.
So we do have time for one more question, if anybody has one. Okay, well then, thank you so much, Abeera. It was so great. Oh, sorry. I take it back. There is a question. Okay. Last question comes from Sarah. Do you think British Muslim organizations also have a focus on identity? And how do you think this impacts queer Muslims when it comes to organizing and community, particularly when that's contrasted with how identityless, quote unquote, Muslim political and social organizations are in Muslim majority countries?
Can you clarify the second part of your question? So do you think British Muslim organizations also have a focus on identity? Yes, is the short answer. And I'm happy to give a longer answer to that. But when you say, how do you think this impacts queer Muslims when it comes to organizing community, when that's contrast with identityless Muslim, I'm not sure what you mean by identityless Muslim political and social organizations in Muslim majority countries. I can try. I'm basically just asking for a clarification so that I don't incorrectly like answer your question based on what I think you're asking for. But I actually don't think that Muslim majority countries are painted as identityless. Like I don't think that that's like in the kind of like hegemonic or like dominant formation. They're not necessarily position it as identityless as much as they're like I think I need some clarification on what you mean by that context. But I will, so to answer your first question though, do you think British Muslim organizations also have a focus on identity? Absolutely, yes, they do. And I think there's a lot of work that's been done on basically like Arun Kandani has written a lot about how I think it's Arun Kandani has written a lot about how the cropping up of British Muslim, like so-called British Muslim organizations goes hand in hand with like the rise of New Labour and how they tried to manage different kind of racial and social groups in the country. So it's not simply a narrative of like post 9/11 Muslims become like this like racialized group. And it's more, I think, useful to think about how like there's a certain like political the aim of like political navigation of this group and like maintenance and kind of disciplining of this group by the state. Seeing this as a separate identity when Muslims are mobilizing. Okay, yeah, I think like I do think that there is I think this is what I mean. So when you say queer Muslims are less seen as a separate identity, for example, in the Levant, like I can't necessarily speak to the Levantine context. But I do think that this is precisely what indicates the kind of social, historical, political like circumstance of what I mean by the category of queer Muslim. So for example, a lot of literature on sexuality in Islam does this kind of assumption that there is this like coherent category of a queer Muslim and relies on these like broad level like assumptions that queer Muslims existed like in the Muslim world, you know, which kind of erases the kind of the different populations that exist in the so-called Muslim world, and also does this work of kind of creating and homogenizing the Muslim world itself. So in this sense, I do agree with Masad's argument. This is what I meant by the ambivalence to Masad's argument, in that like a lot of this work on sexuality in Islam actually like does the work of homogenizing the category of Islam as well, which is an imperial project, right? Which is the way that like what he means, like the way that imperial capital works, is that like Arab nationalists, for example, and Orientalists, like it took on the categories of Orientalists. So in that sense, this kind of assumption that there is a Muslim world where like a queer Muslim exists is taking on a kind of essentialized notion of the Muslim world, of the category of Islam, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Great. That's wonderful. I should also say one of the most sort of careful and generous readings of Masad. I think I have been guilty of sort of not being as careful as I could have been. As was the whole thing overall. So again, thank you so much for joining us, Abeera. That was really great. And thank you to everyone else who came. Thanks for your questions and the discussion. I hope to see you at one of the future